On today's NASM CPT podcast with me, Rick Richey, I explore some big problems from the big toe. I share a story about friends who are working with a high profile MLB player whose hip issues seemingly stemmed from what was a big toe issue. I'll also talk about the windless mechanism regarding how the big toe gets more rigid as the big toe goes into extension. And then finally, I take a little bit of time and I talk about increasing range of motion at the big toe and what are some of the ways that we can do that. And then finally, how can we build some strength in the toe muscles, big toe in particular? All right, make sure that you like, follow, subscribe, and leave a 5-star review. Now, here's the episode, Big Problems from the Big Toe.
You're listening to the NASM CPT Podcast with Rick Richey, winner of the Share Care Emmy Award for Social Storytelling and the official podcast of the National Academy of Sports Medicine.
Y'all, and welcome to the NASM CPT Podcast. My name is Rick Richey, and today I want to talk about the big problems that you can have due to your big toe. So let's start this conversation with this. An interesting story. So I have two friends, two colleagues, two people who worked with one big athlete, who's a baseball player. And this baseball player, really talented, big money player, and just kept having issues with the hip. So they go through and they're practicing, what's our internal rotation, external rotation, what's your hip flexion, hip extension, let's look at your knees, let's look at your ankle, dorsiflexion. Okay, working on dorsiflexion, what's your plantar flexion, let's look at and they go through abduction at the hip, all of these things at the hip. Let's test your core stability, and we're going through core work. And then finally they go, okay, let's look at your big toe extension. And from the non-problematic side to the problematic side, there was significant difference in the big toe extension, or some people refer to dorsiflexion of the big toe. I don't like the word dorsiflexion. I'm going to soapbox this for a moment. When people say dorsiflexion of the big toe, it doesn't make any sense because there's no flexion. When you look at the heel bone and there's plantar flexion and dorsiflexion, there's the heel bone extends the heel bone extends past the tibia and fibula, and the front of the foot does too. So on each side, there's actual flexion that takes place, whether you measure it on the posterior or the anterior side, because either way can be considered flexion or extension based off the movement, which is why it has its own words. However, the big toe does not do that. The big toe can flex, the big toe can extend, and I understand why they would call it dorsiflexion. I just don't like the term, so I say extension of the big toe. So they go and they look at the extension of the big toe and they say, okay, well, let's do some mobility work and let's get your extension at the big toe and let's work on it and create mobility. And all of a sudden the hip starts doing better. But why? Why does that happen? Well, especially a rotational athlete. So whether you're throwing punches or swinging a baseball bat or you're swinging a tennis racket, where does this come from? Well, the thing is that if you can't rotate onto your big toe because the big toe doesn't extend, so you can't rotate onto it, because otherwise, if it doesn't extend, you're either on the side of the big toe or you're at a point, which nobody's putting weight outside of ballet on a point in their big toe. So what they end up doing is just over-rotating from the hips and getting that end range of motion, potentially leading to some pinching, potentially leading to some labral tears. So there's a lot of potential that can build up simply because you can't extend the big toe when you rotate. So it's a valuable thing to look at. And here's another really interesting thing. A lot of people have mobility issues at the big toe, but you look at the flexibility, they have very, very inflexible big toe muscles. The flexor hallucis longus gets stretched when you go into toe extension, extensor hallucis longus, so not dorsiflexor and plantar flexor. I'm just going to argue with other biomechanics, people when it comes to dorsal and plantar flexion of the big toe, extension of the big toe. And look at it. When you go into this movement, they're limited in extension. So their flexor hallucis longus, the toe muscle, big toe muscle, is limited. But also, if you were to test it, it also tests very weak. So it's this weird kind of thing where you've got these short, tight, overactive, weak muscles. And we see that all the time. We see that in the hip flexors. We see people with short, tight, overactive hip flexors. They're in an anterior pelvic tilt. They sit all the time. And then when you ask them to lift their leg against resistance, and they got nada. Well, what do we do? You can stretch and strengthen at the same time. It's okay. You can do two things at once. There can be two problems that seem opposite, but also that's problematic. So what they did, they worked with this person, their big toe, and all the hip issues got so much better. So we're going to look at the big toe. We're going to explore the big toe, and we'll get into it in just a moment, because this episode of the NASM CPT Podcast is brought to you by NASM One, the membership for trainers and coaches. Members enjoy unlimited access to hundreds of career resources. Get the Edge app to schedule and program clients. Enjoy half off all certifications and specializations, access to free CEUs, and more. All of this for just $35 a month. Go to nasm.org/membership to learn more about NASM One. All right, so let's talk about something interesting. It's called the windlass mechanism. And this is when the big toe goes into extension, not dorsiflexion, and it pulls on the plantar aponeurosis. Now, the plantar aponeurosis, you've probably heard of the aponeurosis in the low back, right? So this is an aponeurosis, which is a big flat piece of tissue, a fascia, that goes across the bottom of the foot and toward this into the big toe past the first MTP joint. Well, here's what happens. When you go into toe extension, it pulls on the plantar aponeurosis, which pulls the heels and the toes slightly closer together, and that creates a rigid foot. Oh, you have a softer foot when you land, when you go into a heel strike, and that helps to absorb some of the forces when going into that heel strike, but you need a harder foot as you start to create some propulsion as you go into plantar flexion, and that big toe goes into extension, and it shortens the foot. It makes those metatarsals more rigid. It increases the arch and the medial longitudinal arch, and it gives you something to push off of. All right, well, this is really good. But here's what's interesting. When you wear shoes, that doesn't happen. When you wear shoes, you don't get those things. And so one of the issues that I think we need to be really aware of is that we can mess up some of the mechanics of our natural mechanics of our feet when it comes to wearing shoes. What are you saying, Rick? Don't wear shoes? No, I'm just saying that some of these can be off kilter a little bit. No, you can test this windlass test by doing this. So you go into your toe, all right? So you can test your toe range of motion. You can fully extend your big toe against the wall. This is what I like to do, and this is a drill I want you to consider. All right, so you go against the wall with your big toe. So your first MTP joint is kind of up against the wall, and your big toe is extended. Now, if you can't get into that, you're limited in that, then that's one of the things that shows the challenge in your big toe mobility. So the big toe mobility, and we noticed that we had hip problems and some people have knee problems based on the same story, where I've got range of motion where I'm twisting from my hip, but the knee, because I can't go into big toe extension, the knee will go into increased valgus. So just because of big toe issues, I've got increased potential knee issues, potential hip issues, and then it can work itself up the kinetic chain. In fact, when I was in grad school for my master's in exercise science, then one of the questions were, how can you see somebody when they're doing a squat and they turn out on their left foot, how can that lead to potential right shoulder pain? And you just kind of go through the mechanics of internal rotation at the knee, the valgus that takes place, internal rotation at the hip, the hike that might take place there, which leads to a tightness in the lats as a compensator, which can lead to the increased opposite side because you're limited in your glute activation. So the opposite side lat based off the posterior crisscross that takes place from the lats to the opposite glute. That tight lat leads to a anterior pull on the shoulder and leads to potential impingement. Now, this is all interesting. It's the regional interdependence model of concern, and there's a lot of research that goes into the regional interdependence model where there's a joint somewhere leading to issues somewhere else. So one of the things that I want you to do is practice this big toe range of motion, see what you got. So you're going to keep your heel on the floor, your big toe is fully extended against the wall, and your forefoot is still touching the floor. You're just big toes up against the wall and extended back. Now, keeping your heel on the floor, I just want you to lean forward, see if you can touch your knee into the wall. Some people can, and some people can't, right? And I'll tell you this. Some people, you're going to feel nothing. You get nothing. There are no limitations at all. Some of you will feel very limited. Some of you, like me, when I used to have plantar fasciitis on my right side, if I did the big toe extension, keeping my heel on the ground, big toes up against the wall, and I just bend my knee into the wall, if I did that quick, I'd put a hole into the drywall because there's zero limitations. However, on my other side, it's incredibly limited, not anymore, much better now, but also my plantar fasciitis has gotten better. So doing this with the big toe extended, pushing my knee towards the wall, I mean, it took me days, weeks to be able to even be able to touch. And even to this day, it's still tighter where it takes me a while to even get my knee to touch. I mean, not as much, but like on my first go, it doesn't touch the wall until I breathe into it. And then finally my knee can make that connection. Now, let's look at the weakness that goes on in the big toe, because I think that's a good mobility exercise. It can be something that shows that if your big toe extends and you don't see the arch, then there's an issue with the windlass mechanism. And there can be some potential with the plantar fascia because of some tightness in the big toe. Now, plantar fasciitis has a lot to do with a lot of things. Tight calves. There's even indications in some research that show just posterior chain tightness from the low back, from the hamstrings, calves, all the way into the bottom of the foot. That all has relevance when it comes to plantar fasciitis. So this is all something, but I want you to also take into consideration the role that the big toe plays in this. Now, weakness in the big toe is a concern. So that windlass mechanism doesn't exist while wearing shoes, can definitely limit our function. So I'm going to talk about some big toe exercises. Here's some things you can do. One, I love, and I have almost every single person that I train with do this every single day, is we practice balance exercises. And when you practice the balance exercise, you're going to try to go into a short foot, which strengthens the intrinsic muscles in the foot, but I also have them push their big toe down into the ground. So it gives a little bit of purchase. It gives something to grab onto, some strength in the foot to hold the rest of your body on balance up on. Because remember, if you have a rigid surface, then you have a stronger likelihood to stabilize than you do on a softer surface. And if your foot is soft, then you're going to get a lot more wiggling. And each time you wiggle, you have to have a counter wiggle above it in order to stack these joints on top of each other. So we're going to consider that. So creating the short foot, single leg balance, pressing the big toe down. And of course, you can do other big toe exercises. I like to have people even just put a band around their knees. And I call them knee wiggles, where your feet are pointed straight ahead. And you look like you're doing that thing where you're crisscrossing your hands. And when your knees touch, you cross your hands back. You don't have to do the hand part, just do the knee wiggle part, so that every time your knees go closer together, let's say your feet are hip width apart, pointed straight ahead, maybe shoulder width apart, a little bit wider. As your feet lower down, you'll notice that the arch flattens. And as your knees go apart, that the arch increases. Well, as the knee goes apart, you've got to keep your big toe pressed down into the floor. And what that'll do is that'll create a shorter foot. The muscles in the foot are going to shorten or arch. You're going to get much bigger arch. And so for my flat-footed friends out there, getting an arch in the foot's a big win no matter what. So as you keep your feet, big toe down, your knees abduct, so you're going into varus, keeping the big toe down. Some of y'all are going to get cramps in your big toe muscle, the cramps in the feet muscle, because it's just the weakness in the foot. And then as you go into this kind of valgus position, the knee knock position, you're still going to try to maintain the arch. Now, you will lose the arch, but what that does is it gets this eccentric strengthening that goes on. So it's not just this concentric shortening, but it is an eccentric lengthening of the muscles as well. All right. One of the other things you can do is that while you're doing any foot exercise, whether you're just keeping your foot on the ground, pressing the big toe down, you can put a band under the toe, you can put a towel under the toe, and just pull on it. And they have to push down and not let the band or the towel move. And you can do that on the single leg balance exercises. You can do that on the knee wiggle exercises, I was just saying, or regress all the way down and just have the foot on the floor, barefoot. Yeah, you could keep your socks on. So keeping the arch there, pressing the big toe down into a towel, pressing it down into a band, and you're just pulling it and trying to get them to push down hard without losing it. It's helped to build strength in the flexors of the big toe. One of the other things, last exercise I like to do is I like to do a floor bridge with my feet hanging off of a bench. So I'm lying on the floor and my feet are on a bench, but not really. My feet are hanging off the bench. The only thing on the bench is my big toe. My big toes. So I've got both of my big toes, or even all of my smallies on there too. So just my toes on there, and I'm going to plantar flex. I'm going to drive my big toe down into the bench. Nothing on my foot is on except for my toes. And then as I'm lying down, I bridge up, and my toes are just clinging on like a foot rock climber, just holding on with my big toes as I lift my hips up into a bridge, holding on tight, strengthening the muscles in my feet. And that's one of the exercises I absolutely love, to strengthen the muscles in the feet, in the big toe, because dang it, that big toe, there can be some issues with it. So we're going to increase mobility, we're going to increase strength, and we're going to help increase function up the kinetic chain by doing so. All right, y'all. Thanks for listening. Like, subscribe, share with your fitness friends and family. And thank you to my producer, Eric Sorensen. If you want to reach out to me, you can hit me up on Instagram at dr.rickrichey or email me, rick.richey@nasm.org. You'll keep inspiring people to fitness. Thanks for listening. This has been the NASM CPT Podcast.